Okay, right. So we're going to talk today about perhaps a greater clarification and understanding of the age of Aquarius. You know, that I hear and see on social media a lot of glib talk about the new age. And if one thing the masters have always exhorted us to do is to just be that little bit more analytical in our thinking, not to allow woolly expressions or emotional ideas of what this new age might be about. And so I'd like to take your attention back to the beginning of the age of Pisces 2,000 years ago, and ask you to consider what the state of science was like at the time of the beginning of AD and the writing of the New Testament. It was pretty much non-existent because the fifth ray was not in manifestation. And if you, as theosophists, care to do and look at Isis Unveiled, Volume 1, Science, you'll see that roll the ball nearly 2,000 years later, what a rudimentary state science was in even in the 1800s, when Madame Blavatsky wrote that book, Volume 1, Isis Unveiled on Science. And it's only really in the last 200 years has science began to start its cycle of manifestation, and it is going to be strongly prevalent in the age of Aquarius, which seems to be forgotten by so many people who perhaps have souls still steeped in the Piscean age. Well, we've had 2,000 years of Pisces, and we must have had lots of incarnations in that time, working on the sixth ray of devotion and idealism, working through the various religious attractions and wars that there have been as a result. And all the time, quietly, according to the Master Dwaj Kuhl writing in the Alice Bailey books, there's been a slow obscuration of that ray, starting, he says, in 1645. Well, in 2021, we look at the emotional state of some nations even, and we say, well, obscuration, the ray of emotion, don't think so. That's when it was going into obscuration. That's the cycle of the ray. But we've held on to it. Humanity's held on to it much longer, in my view. My suggestion is much longer than it should have done, because we can't seem to let go of cycles which have already impregnated themselves in, admittedly, 2,000 years, and even before that as well, because it was prevalent in the age before then. But now it isn't the commanding ray. And it's worth looking at the proportions of the rays in the age of Aquarius, so we are all clear. Aquarius is 40% ray 7, which is the ray of ritual, ceremonial, order and magic, where we describe magic as the spiritualizing of matter. And this is the bringing down of the very potent first ray of will and power through mind, and then planting it in the physical kingdoms that we know as mineral, flowering plant and vegetable, animal and human. And that is the creation of the plan, the divine plan, known as the purpose of God, translated through the custodians of the plan, the hierarchy or the love of God, through humanity into the creation of the kingdom of God on earth, as it were. So the ray 7, 40%, big input, but of equal standing in the ray in the ray analysis of Aquarius is the ray of science. And to give it its full name, it's the ray of concrete knowledge and analytical science. And people sometimes say to me at ray workshops, I didn't know there was any ray 5 in Aquarius. And I said, well, if Pisces is the age of I believe, what's Aquarius? The age of I know. I said, well, can we go from no to knowledge? The ray, the fifth ray of knowledge. Ah, right. Yes. Knowledge. Wasn't thinking in terms of science. Science is trying to bottom out and put analytical detail into the world that we live in. And 121 years ago, in 1900, we had the birth of something which we know as quantum physics, which has started the, to me, true cyclical nature of the fifth ray. Under the aegis of the Master Hilarion, we are going to get revelations of how our worlds exist in objective form. And so we can have a spiritual experience, and I can say, I've been up onto the wavelength of Buddy and done all these marvelous things altruistically for people, and I can feel that joy in my heart if I have done that. I'm not saying I've done it. If I have done it, I can feel that in my heart. And that is a subjective feeling. Science is working bottom up, and it's trying to discover layer after layer of energy. And it's doing that by peering its focus and its gaze into, in one end, the microscopic, quantum physics, and in one end, the other end of the spectrum, the macroscopic. And it's looking out into far space and black holes and galaxies. So it's looking both ways. And today I'm going to be mainly talking, because there's so much to talk about anyway, about quantum physics, because I've been looking at this for about 15 years and trying to pull around the fact that it appears to be, and a lot of what I've got on the sheets to come, which Tim will be good enough to show us when we get there, is to do with suggestions about the fact that as the scientists peer down into the microscopic and ever-looking, the collider at CERN in Switzerland, looking for the ultimate particle, the smallest possible particle, we are only ever on the forefront of knowledge, the pioneers. We're never going to get there because there's always something else to be discovered. You know, we used to think the world was flat, and somebody suggested it wasn't and was ridiculed for it. So wherever we are with science, we've not finished the journey yet. And in fact, scientists themselves have said that 96% of the energy and matter in the universe is dark. We only understand about 4%, and that will be our electromagnetic spectrum, of which the visible part is the tiny bit that we can see. The mechanism of our eyes allows us to see a tiny little bit of the electromagnetic spectrum between the red and the violet. And of course, infrared one end, ultraviolet, and then you go right the way through the radio waves at one end and the X-rays and gamma rays at the other end. And so that's the known part of the universe, but everything else is classified as dark, and we will be touching on this as we go through. And so science in 1900, and I haven't got time to go into, I've got 3 books to tell you about if you want to look into this yourself. There was the beginning through somebody called Max Planck of the understanding of quanta, which is little packets of light. What this essentially means to us is that there was an excursion into worlds which start to make sense when we look at the fact that ancient wisdom has been talking about subtle matter more subtle than the physical. And what has been found in this world in the 121 years has been the fact that there are completely different laws and completely different regimes of being, which again we will touch on, in this microscopic world as compared to what is called the classical world of physics, which does relate to what we pick up normally in our 5 gross senses. So the brain is something which I'm going to call as a structure very particulate, because it gives us an acuity of sensation which is very, very clearly enabling us to understand the world as we understand it. So if we throw a ball in a certain direction and with a certain force, it will have a momentum, and that momentum will be its mass times its velocity, and we will know how it bounces, how it projects, etc. We know that under the laws of classical physics, all of that is explained, and the same for light, and the same for heat, and the same for sound, etc. We've got it bottomed out, and that's the physics I learned in school up to what was called O level then in the late 1960s. That's classical physics. But the laws of quantum physics, which is the physics of the very, very, very small, show us that there is something else. And the main thing that it's shown us in terms of being is that an energy such as a particle, which we can see in an atom, we used to think an atom was one being, but of course we now know that it is a nucleus with a neutral particle in called a neutron, a number of neutrons, and protons, which are positively charged, and then orbiting around them are these tiny little negatively charged particles called electrons. And we called them particles, and we called them electrons. And this was part of understanding the basic micro side of physics. But now we have got instruments which have allowed us to look deeper and deeper. Well, we know that a particle can exist as a wave. And that particle, when it exists as a wave, exhibits completely different functions from the existence of a particle. And this enables me to bring in the Hermetic axiom, which we know and we quote quite often, or I certainly do, as above, so below. And if we turn that on its head and say, as below, so above, then we are confronted with the fact that we might be able to look into these micro worlds and see that there are laws concerning the inner side of our nature, which can be explained by the laws of the very small. And I want to give you a good example of that. When an electron is acting as a wave, or light acting as a wave, because it can be a particle as well, and there's a very famous experiment called the Two-Slit Experiment, which demonstrates what I'm going to say to an extent. We may come on to that later. But for now, if I want to take the idea of the fact that waves interfere, they do so on the macro level as well. Think of waves. You're standing on a windy day and it's high tide. You can see waves coming in, hitting the promenade wall and coming back out. And where they hit a wave, which is coming in and at its height, they make it even higher, called superposition this, and where they cancel each other out, there's a trough. We understand the idea of waves, and we see this in the Two-Slit Experiment, that we have the idea of the fact that waves interfere with each other. Waves interfere with each other. And where that wave is interfering and it becomes sustained interference, and that sustaining is also an intense interference, you put the two together, we have this wonderful discovery of science of something called entanglement. We have the entanglement of waves, which is sustained and intense interference. And we can entangle with the wavicular side of our nature. And so the suggestion is that we can use quantum, well, I can see the parallels because of the Hermetic axiom, that we can use the idea of the wavicular side of man, who is particular in his physical body and brain. Very much the case. We can understand that that is the most solid a unit of energy can become, a particle. We're like a particle. But from the etheric, astral, mental, higher and lower, buddhic, atmic, in my view, right the way up to the monad, we are wavicular. And therefore we can entangle at any of those levels. And in fact, in the science of yoga, which shows 7 chakras, it also, as you look into, as I have done, energy interactions between 2 people, we can see that at the emotional right the way up to the monad, we can interact with people at different levels. And when we do, we can set their chakras going at different levels. Mostly we seem to be affecting each other's solar plexus chakra. But it's through this idea of waves that and an understanding of our wavicular body, that in fact, we should understand the things about life and death that are so important. And so under this idea, death would become the ceasing of the particular nature and a return to a full wavicular nature in between incarnations. And that's all we lose. We don't lose any identity in terms of energies that we've gained, of course, as the ancient wisdom would say, but we have just oscillated fully towards the wavicular side. And in fact, in sleep at night, we're not very particular, because that brain, which is part of the particle structure and gives us this tangibility in the outside world, is pretty much switched off, isn't it? And we go into realms which we don't fully understand, because the brain, being a particular structure, does not really is not set up to help us to understand our inner intimations from sleep, because the brain has been put to sleep pretty much so in that time. And so this matter of life and death appears to be a matter of what Niels Bohr, one of the founding fathers of quantum physics, and if you really do get interested in this, go and have a look at the film with Daniel Craig in it. No, I don't mean No Time to Die, that's breaking box office records. I mean, go and have a look at the film Copenhagen, where he and one other actor, just the 2 of them for the whole film, I've seen the play as well, act out the conversation between Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr. More about Heisenberg later. Niels Bohr said, we must understand that there is, although they're mutually exclusive, the nature of the wave and the nature of the particle, there is a complementarity, and that's the word he used, a complementarity between wavicular nature and particular nature. And they go together so well as to indicate that they are a fundamental principle of the universe. And so this idea of us coming down into incarnation, dipped into being a particle, released to being a wave, dipped into being a particle, released into being a wave, is a very natural phenomena that's already been shown to us now by the quantum scientists. That's a suggestion. Of course, when I say dipped into being a particle, we've still got our wavicular nature as well. And we've always got that wavicular nature. So it seems that the wave needs to have particular experience to satisfy this complementarity that Niels Bohr was talking about. And so we see this almost as a necessary evil, where we have to be incarnated to understand life as a particle, but not to let it completely overtake us, because it's only part of the story. And it's much easier to, maybe for average mankind, to side on the side of the particle, because it's so obvious. The brain gives it all that acuity of consciousness. And yes, we're a particle, and thank God we've woken up and we can smell the coffee now and start our day properly, and I'm alive again. But that's the particular side only. So also the idea that our experience is gained in a particle world by being a particle and then morphing back into becoming a wave. And I do think that the axiom that I mentioned does give us the eligibility to consider that what's going on in the minute worlds is happening for our experience and benefit in the outside world once we make the connection. And Niels Bohr gave us the connection in the term complementarity. Okay, Tim, could you show of sheet 1, the first part? I won't be spending too long on these, and I don't know if people want these, let us know, and either Tim or myself can email you these sheets if you find these at all interesting. So this was something I was been looking at for about 15 years ago. I started looking at this, and I put together some workshops on the nature of reality. I called them quantum unconsciousness. And I'm just going to make some points here. In a talk like this, I can only really give you an appreciation of things, but if I drop some terms in, through the 3 reference books that I mentioned, and you only need one of them at the end, I'll show you them here, you might be interested in one or more of the topics. What we've got in part A are based around something called decoherence. And yes, we do have to grapple with some terminology here, is if you look on the left-hand side, the understanding of the scientists is that if a quantum system existed on its own, and we'll talk about the interaction a bit later on as well, that the microscopic world would be a world where this quantum suppresses any chaos when isolated. In other words, in a world of just waves, there is no chaos. And I would suggest that this is a pralaya. This is a pralaya where everything is interned and not manifest in terms of particles. And that's the microscopic world. We go over to the right-hand side in the macroscopic world, that when there is a movement from wave to particle, chaos re-emerges as a feature of our everyday world. In other words, where the internal become externalized, a degree of control and order is lost, and we get the chaotic happenings that happen in a particular world, like the world that we live in. And in moving from this idealistic system, which doesn't exist for us in manifestation, because we've always got a macroscopic world, but the idea is if you did have this, then the fall from grace, as it were, it might even be the fall out of the Garden of Eden, because of course the Garden of Eden was said to be a place of subjectivity, where it was only when mankind became objective of something, and I would suggest particular, that he couldn't stay in that world anymore and had to fall into matter, which I still believe was part of the plan of evolution anyway, and it wasn't just an accident. The fall of man was meant to happen so he could have a particulate nature. So there we are. That's the first part of that. And the process is called decoherence, in moving from something wavicular to something particulate, something micro to something macro, or something inner world to outer world. So if you could just have a look at part B, please, a little bit closer. That's great. Yeah, that's great. This is what I was talking about before, alluding to the fact that my understanding now, and we can all research this, it does help if we've got a fifth ray mind. According to the ray analyses I've had done, I did my own through Alice Bailey's work. It's confirmed by Dr. Baker as having a fifth ray mind. It does help one to do this type of work, because you're happy to analyze and research and dig down. And I'm sure many theosophists have got a fifth ray mind as well, and would find this interesting. And as a result of it, I've tried to summarize in B that I think that the study of quantum mechanics, which, remember, is the behavior of tiny particles in the microscopic worlds, and I would say that some of these particles haven't yet been discovered, and so a lot of them haven't been discovered, takes us further down into the idea of dark matter and what the scientists are saying is yet to be discovered. And human consciousness. And human consciousness, I've defined it there: astral, lower mental, higher mental, buddhic and atma. In other words, and it's my view that we've only just started this process with the quantum worlds, and that's the etheric. That's the etheric, I think, the quantum, and that we're going to discover smaller worlds, which will be the astral, and the scientists will even smaller worlds, which will be the mental, and so through the buddhic and the atmic, that we're going to find there are particles of increasing levels of subtlety, just as the ancient wisdom always said there was, and waiting to be discovered by science. But the difference is there's a sea change going on between the laws of the particle in classical physics and the laws of the wave, which cover a whole range of energies, all the energies that we're interested in when we are studying the ancient wisdom, right the way up from the personality, astral, and lower mental, right the way up to the Atma Buddhimanas that we can see there as well. Now, one of the fascinating things that comes out of all this is that we now know from science that when an observer observes a set of waves, then the waves are what's called collapse to a particle. They collapse to a particle. And very briefly, and again, you can look at it in any of the books that I'm going to recommend, this two-slit experiment, particles of light are passed through a screen with two openings in it. And as the particles pass through, they split into waves. And on the other side of the screen, those waves interfere. And they interfere in a pattern so that on a screen, you can see light where the two waves have come together, dark where they've cancelled out, light come together, dark cancelled out, in this idea of another wave theory idea of superposition. But when an observer looks at the experiment, the whole screen goes black. And that is called, in quantum physics, the collapse of the wave function to a particle. And this leads on further to the idea that is the universe a thought form in the mind of God? If you read that wonderful book by Diane Fortune called The Cosmic Doctrine, this is exactly what she says in the section, The Creation of a Universe, that in the cosmic state, there is nothing to be aware of other than oneself. This is the cosmic being, the cosmic energy, the focus of energy. And so it projects a concept of itself. And that concept of itself is out of the idea of mind. And so we get here, and there's other books will say it, I'm quite sure, we get the idea in the ancient wisdom of the Sanat Kumara, the planetary logos, the Ancient of Days, and then we get the Silent Watcher. And there is a branch of thinking called solipsism, which is at has at its center the idea that an observer, one arm missing from there, I'm afraid, is at the center of the universe, and that the universe is this thought form, an imagination in the mind of God, in the consciousness of God. And I'm throwing it there as a suggestion. I'm trying to link my knowledge of the ancient wisdom, which goes back 40 years and is obviously continuing as it is for all of us, expanding in a way I'm going to talk about on sheet 2. But also is the fact that we are understanding, trying to understand what science is telling us. And if I was to say this to you, that I did science at university, which included physics and quantum physics, I've still got some of my books. And the mathematics of quantum physics is something which you don't do at a lecture because I think equations are great things for turning people off. But there is something in the Schrödinger equation which defines the wave function, how a particle moves into a wave and where that wave function will be. And this brings in statistical physics and probabilities. But in mathematical terms, it brings in an imaginary number called I. And I is the square root of -1. And it seems to be that all the magical things about quantum physics are around equations, which we don't deal with in this, because that's the quantitative treatment of it's nothing to stop people doing it. There's a book out on quantum physics called The Theoretical Minimum. And that's saying what you need to know in quantum physics in terms of the mathematics of it. But that mathematics, and I've looked at it, it's got differential equations as part of calculus, complex numbers in terms of I, it all matches up. And I remember studying that. I had to do a bit of work on that to get to that point of understanding the mathematics. Nobody disputes the mathematics. What does seem to be in dispute is the interpretation. The interpretation, so much so that I've got to mention the Copenhagen, which is Niels Bohr idea, which says that nothing in the universe exists unless there's an observer. And so if we had this coffee mug here and no one was observing that coffee mug, not me, not you, that coffee mug would not exist. And this is what they teach in quantum physics at the universities. Now, you may have your view on that, but the science is raging. And if you buy New Scientist like I do occasionally, I've got plenty of back numbers of it, the arguments will continue, because it would seem that if you don't accept that, the one other theory that you've got to accept, where there isn't an observer measuring a wave and the wave collapsing to a particle and the particle being observed, then you're into the realm of a multiverse. You're into the realm of many, many worlds. Somebody called Hugh Everett looked into this, and it's a fascinating thing in the books that if you want to have a look at it yourself. For today, we're not going to go that detail because we've got other things to consider here. So the idea then of the observation of something is very, very important. And I'm going to give you a practical application of this because somebody called Oscar Brunner in the mid-1920s took manuscripts. It could have been sequences of notes from Wagner, writings from Charles Dickens, paintings from Leonardo da Vinci. And in another talk, I can give you some scores. Probably got them here, actually. It wasn't going to be part of the talk. He measured the energy that was coming off, and you can read about this yourself, the energy that came off these documents, many, many years later, in what he called degrees biometric. And what scientists have, it didn't make much sense at the time, I'll come back to it. What scientists have discovered is that the optic nerves point forward. They point forward when we look at something. But when we bring the optic nerves to a point, which we do when we start to write something, or paint something, or sculpt something, we bring the optic nerves to a focus. Then we pour quantum energy, the same quantum energy that came from our eyes when the observer collapsed that wave function in the two-slit experiment, collapses, the observer can pour quantum energy into the work that they are doing. And the understanding that I have of that is that we're all capable of this energy, but it depends on the contact we have with our soul as to the quantity of energy, because it is Atma Buddhi Manas. This quantum energy is Atma Buddhi Manas. Now, this fits with what I was saying in part B of that sheet, where the wavicular side includes Atma Buddhi and Manas. And this is the secret of creativity. All of those actions that I mentioned about bringing the optic nerves to a point when we do something, as in writing, painting, drawing, etc., and it can be, writing music, it could be painting pictures, whatever, are creative. The acts of creativity. And who came out on top? Leonardo da Vinci, this is in Oscar Brunner's measurements, of 725. And he took average man was coming out at 350. But after Leonardo da Vinci, we had Michelangelo at 689, Charles Dickens at 540, Wagner at 538, Chopin 550, etc. We can discuss this more. Oscar Brunner had this amazing machine that could do this, but it's only science that's made sense of his findings in terms of what comes out of our eyes. And also what's important is because any notes that I do right now and been doing for many years, I write in pencil, is that if you are drawing or writing in pencil and you use a soft lead, it is much more diffuse than a biro or a hard pencil. And it seems that these energies of Atma Buddhi Manas coming through and being focused by the optic nerve are much more able to get into the substance of what you're writing. And so if I'm trying to impregnate my notes with soul, Atma Buddhi Manas, I write in pencil. And I write in pencil almost exclusively now so that I can get a better connection with what I call the higher states of consciousness. And therefore, it's worth remembering that if that was the case, you could write to somebody with a very definite thought. You can write some words and the words don't have to make sense, but you could write a note out in pencil, but imbue in that a very particular thought, mental, or emotion, or idea. Give it to them and say, what are you picking up from that? I've done it with people. I did it with a guy who I gave a check for, and I wrote in biro, and he rung me back and he said, I could feel, biro, not pencil, I could feel and understand the thought and the love that came behind that money that you sent to me. And he could pick that up from me. Now, he may have a different sense of it. I'm saying with pencil, we should all be able to, because average man is emitting 350. Okay, it's only half of what Leonardo da Vinci, but I think we all understand that Leonardo da Vinci was particularly advanced, and it didn't surprise me when I researched this work of Oscar Brunner. Okay, we can look at this more so, and this idea of the optic nerves being brought to a point and their connection with the soul at some other point. So if we could go on to the second sheet then, please. Find that one. Thank you. This idea now about what we know, back to the age of Aquarius, what we know and what we don't know. Are we consciously trying to expand our knowledge into unknown areas? Because my understanding now through this appreciation, because that's all I've got of it, this appreciation of some of the concepts in quantum physics, is that if we are particularizing something by studying it, then we are taking it from out of the unknown and into the known. And so there is everything out there to be known. And that would be, but we're ignorant of it while it's wavicular. But when we get to study something, the wavicular nature for us becomes particulate. And in doing that, we bring it into our own consciousness as knowledge. So I've said there, particularization of the microscopic, so you know in the macrocosm. So isn't that exactly why we're down here on Earth? To come down with a particulate nature so we can gain experience. Okay, the physical world will be particular, but emotional and mental and then spiritual. Isn't that the reason that we're down here, to actually particularize or concrete the abstract? And that's why I put those there, the idea that we're trying to bring out of manifestation something into manifestation so that it becomes part of our consciousness, part of our knowledge base. And so we're exhorted, as most of us are in theosophy in any case, to study into realms that interest us, and we can start to fit pieces together in even related things about theosophy. Look at the second objective, which says the comparison of religions, where a fascinating thing, which I've been involved in, Buddhism many years ago, looking at Hinduism through Vedic astrology and other matters, looking at Christianity as well, and seeing how much particularization I can have of this second objective of theosophy, which is highly mental and gives me a greater understanding, any of us a greater understanding. The worst thing we can do is just remain ignorant, because our ring pass knot of consciousness is like that. In doing this, we expand our ring pass knot of consciousness into the unknown worlds by particularizing. And when we do, of course, it's part of our consciousness. And as Dwaj Kul says, everything that we study and understand, when we're finally thrown back into the monadic fire at the end of all our existences, will be etched into our very being, because we've bothered to take the trouble to particularize what is out there otherwise. And this brings me to the idea, if we just go a little bit further up here, of the tree of life. A lot of you will know about the tree of life, that outside of manifestation, which is Kappa, at the crown, we have the Ein Sof and the Ein Sof Or, which is the nothingless, limitless light, which is the coming into manifestation of something which is manifest. And so we get to Kappa, and we are in touch with the absolute unmanifest, which we have through the tree of life been particularizing. And that stream of energy comes in through Kappa, right the way down to Malkuth at the bottom. And then through our myriad incarnations, we climb back way up the tree. And that tree, I believe, that tree of life is climbed by ever increasing particularization. It's just a suggestion by me. I've not taken this from books or anything. It comes through to me when I reflect on the study that I do. Remember with your study that it's very good to contemplate as well. I didn't say meditate there, I contemplate. So there's a degree of reflection required. Get something out of a book, put it down and reflect on it. And when you reflect on it, you slow the thought form down to the extent that other waves can come in and modify it. And so I think I've explained in the words there what we've been trying to do, observing the subtle worlds, which if we don't, we'll be ignorant of. This act of observation converts the energy from waves into particles, and then we know it. It becomes part of our consciousness in the brain, which is particulate. We know it in the brain. And so this whole idea is correlating consciousness with gaining knowledge of the abstract. And we'll be doing this all the time, so it's no big deal in a way. All I'm saying is that the quantum physics, in my view, with its wave-particle duality, is giving us a basis for what we're doing above. And we didn't have that prior to 1900. And we didn't have that when, most of Madame Blavatsky and the early theosophical work was done. And it is important for theosophy to keep up with science because, again, looking at New Scientist and Scientific America as well, which I get occasionally, before quantum physics was popularized, and this is the 1960s, 70s, and 80s maybe, consciousness was not a field the scientists were interested in. Now it's been the buzzword for 20 years at least. And it was consciousness that was the field of theosophy. Theosophy and we talk about consciousness, we're theosophists. The rest of the world don't understand it. Well, in my view, because of quantum physics, they understand consciousness a lot more than we will do if we stick to what theosophy has to tell us. In other words, theosophy has to do with the times. And Tim, who's presenting this today, is a leading light in this because we got a small forum going on something which I was reading just before that you put out, Tim. You might like to say a word of it about the science of consciousness. But in any case, Evolution has to be the expansion of consciousness. That's what the masters tell us. What is evolution if we don't come back with a modified consciousness at each occasion, and not just a modified consciousness, one which is more refined and has gone into higher worlds of higher waves than maybe previously. Expansion of consciousness, and then this can be seen as the continuing and progressive conditioning, which I call particularizing of the universal consciousness. And so we want to bring in the universal consciousness into our particular life, but we have to extend the gaze of our consciousness in order to do that. And so in finishing, I would like to say that after some questions, I will give some books as references. And I suppose today's talk has been just to get you thinking more about the invisible worlds. It's so easy to talk about things which we know and can see and can prove. The quantum physicists are at different sides in this. We are living at an exciting time, but we are also living at the beginning of an age in which the fifth ray of science, concrete knowledge and analytical science is going to show us, I believe, some wondrous things of which we're just seeing the beginning. And I, for one, am very excited about that. And I hope some of you are as well. But I think I'd like to see Tim finish the presentation as such, and like to ask if there are some views and comments and questions.